Socrates. Socrates is a mysterious Greek philosopher in the history of Western world who changed philosophy despite not having written anything. He is credited as the founder of Western philosophy since he was the first moral theorist in the ethical school of thought. There is no data ever contained pertaining to his existence. The only knowledge the world has of Socrates was mostly imparted in the works of his student, Plato, who is one of the most famous philosophers from the classical era of ancient Greece. Socratic method of questioning is the most known contribution from Socrates. He is one of the most promising philosophers, gave birth to the known method to test and expand knowledge through questioning that is only answerable with a yes or no. Philosophers from the 5th century used the Socratic method of questioning to expand their knowledge and test the validity of every piece of information. This method is a strategy for collaborative discourse between people that depends on questioning and answering in order to extract concepts and underlying fundamental ideas. He created this with the intention of assisting his students in recognizing the gaps in every concept and to open a door to a fresh perspective that is connected to the main idea. It also helps students create viewpoints free of self-contradiction by helping them recognize their truths. Socrates' philosophy of self. His philosophy explained that true knowledge is the ability to know nothing, and the ability to recognize one's own limitations reveals how well one understands oneself. Without more explanation, claims are only surface-level pieces of knowledge, but responding to what and how does it work queries will force people to continually reflect and learn. He also added that being able to respond to straightforward questions demonstrates how well one knows oneself. According to Socrates, quote, "A man who believes himself wise is a fool, but a wise man considers himself a fool," end quote, proving that not all of the alleged wise persons are actually wise. A person who knows nothing will make an effort to achieve knowledge despite his or her status, while those who proclaim they are smart will continually feed their egos to be considered superior among all. Being uninformed is a sign of intelligence, yet Socrates, a lover of wisdom, thinks ignorance is a fault if one doesn't dare to learn. According to him, knowledge is not a shallow pond that is immovable and stationary, but rather a stream that flows continuously, which means that there is always a lot to learn, and always something new because knowledge is constant. It will move and change through time. It just all depends on how one chooses to make use of this body of information. Socrates' wisdom was feared at the time by some tyrants, which made them charge him of brainwashing minors. He was forced to choose between banishment or execution by drinking poison. Socrates chose the second option, which gave him peace of mind, since he realized that even though it might result in death, it would be better than confessing to a crime he hadn't committed. Socrates spent his final day in a cell, sitting at his bed in a white robe and waiting patiently for someone to bring the poison he would be ingesting. Hemlock poison, an extremely dangerous chemical that causes respiratory failure, vomiting, and seizures, was the poison he would be drinking. He swallowed the poison when it was given to him without showing any signs of anxiety. This may be a terrible ending, but he doesn't phase since he knew fearing death or thinking it is wicked is equivalent to the assuming knowledge of the unknown. Because no one can be certain of what happens after death or whether it is a blessing or not, since no one can actually narrate what it feels like to die.
Sigmund Freud, born in 1856 and died in 1939. Austrian physician and psychologist who founded what today is known as the psychodynamic approach, an approach to understanding human behavior that focuses on the role of unconscious thoughts, feelings, and memories. According to Rudinesco in 2003 and Taylor in 2009, his work has had a huge impact on our everyday thinking about psychology, and the psychodynamic approach is one of the most important approaches to psychological therapy. Freud is probably the best known of all psychologists, in part because of his impressive observation and analysis of personality. In fact, there are 24 volumes of his writings. As is true of all theories, many of Freud's ingenious ideas have turned out to be at least partially incorrect, and yet other aspects of his theories are still influencing psychology. Freud's view of the self was multi-tiered, divided among the conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious. He explains his psychological model in the following passage from his An Outline of Psychoanalysis. The concept of the unconscious forms the central core in Freud's theory of the structure and dynamics of the human personality. And though the conscious self has an important role to play in our lives, It is the unconscious self that holds the greatest fascination for Freud, and which has a dominant influence in our personalities. Freud's focus on the unconscious self marks a significant departure from previous efforts in philosophy to understand the nature of the self, and in so doing, it challenges the traditional philosophical assumption that the self can be explored and understood primarily through rational reflection and analysis. According to Freud, these two levels of human functioning, the conscious and the unconscious, differ radically both in their content and in the rules and logic that govern them. The unconscious contains basic instinctual drives, including sexuality, aggressiveness, and self-destruction, traumatic memories, unfulfilled wishes and childhood fantasies, thoughts and feelings that would be considered socially taboo. The unconscious level is characterized by the most primitive level of human motivation and human functioning. At this level, the most basic instinctual drives seek immediate gratification or discharge. Unheedful of the demands and restrictions of reality, the naked impulses at this level are governed solely by the pleasure principle. For instance, a university student who is worried about an important test begins to suck on his finger unconsciously. This shows regression type of defense mechanism. The student is retreating to an earlier, more childlike, and safer stage of development. A student who is angry at her professor for a low grade lashes out at her roommate, who is a safer target of her anger. A displacement mechanism diverts threatening impulses unconsciously away from the source of the anxiety and towards a more acceptable source.
In contrast, the conscious self is governed by the reality principle rather than the pleasure principle. And at this level of functioning, behavior and experience are organized in ways that are rational, practical, and appropriate to the social environment. Freud described the conscious mind as consisting of all the mental processes of which we are aware, and this is seen as the tip of the iceberg. For example, you may become aware of feeling thirsty, so you decide to get a drink. Freud believes that evidence of a powerful unconscious self can be found in the content of our dreams, inadvertent slips of tongue, and techniques such as free association used by Freudian psychoanalysts in clinical treatment. However, the most compelling evidence for an unconscious self is to be found in pathological and neurotic behavior. From Freud's standpoint, the neurotic symptom has three essential aspects. It is a sign that the balance of forces within the personality system is disturbed. It is a sign that infantile conflicts have been reactivated. And it is itself an attempt at a spontaneous cure, an attempt at adaptation, although the individual may be worse off with his or her neurotic adaptation than without it. For example, an individual who experienced traumatic frustration, conflict, and guilt centering on his toilet training may adapt to this potentially threatening situation by compulsively washing his hands several hundred times a day in an effort to assuage his guilt and resolve his emotionally charged conflicts. Although such an adaptation may forestall the disruption of his conscious level of functioning by the anxiety generated by his unconscious conflicts and painful emotions, from the standpoint of normal overall functioning, it could not be considered to be a particularly successful one. Evidence of your unconscious. Although the contents of the unconscious cannot be observed directly, we can observe them indirectly, like seeing footprints in the sand or dusting for fingerprints. There are several areas in which unconscious influences are evident. This is an opportunity for you to look for evidence of unconscious functioning in each of these areas. Slips of the tongue. Think about a time in which you unexpectedly said what you really thought rather than what you intended to say. For example, I think your new haircut looks atrocious. Instead of your intended, I think your new haircut looks attractive. Do you think this is persuasive evidence for Freud's concept of the unconscious? Next is dreams. Describe a particularly disturbing dream or a recurring dream that expressed surprising or disturbing themes. What do you think the dream really meant? Do you think the dream is persuasive evidence for Freud's concept of the unconscious? Lastly, neurosis. Describe one sort of neurotic behavior in which you engage. For example, do you have a compulsion to check and recheck locks? To eat too much or too little? To perform superstitious rituals? To be overly suspicious or paranoid about others' intentions? To feel excessively guilt about something? To be chronically depressed? What do you think is the origin of this neurosis? Do you think this syndrome is persuasive evidence for Freud's concept of the unconscious?
Gilbert Ryle was born on August 19, 1900, in Brighton, Sussex, England. He attended Queen's College, Oxford, in 1919 to study classics. During this time, soon willingly into philosophy, graduating with first-class honors in the new modern grade school of philosophy, politics, and economics in 1924. And the same year, following his graduation, he got a lectureship in philosophy at Christ Church College, where he remained for a year before becoming a tutor. He would stay in Oxford for the rest of his academic career, retiring in 1968. He took over as Mind's editor following G.E. Moore, retired in 1947. After his retirement, he moved to the Oxfordshire village of Islip with his twin sister Mary. He died on October 6, 1976 in Whitby, Yorkshire. We're all just a bundle of behaviors caused by the physical workings of the body, according to Ryle. He believed that oneself comes from the behavior of the person. How we manifest to ourselves of who we are, that self is how you behave. As mentioned, his notion of dualism is that the behavior that we show emotions and actions are the reflection in our mind. When we understand others' point of view, we consider ourselves as I to put ourselves in that situation by observing them. By this, we form our own impressions, interpretations, depending on the physical observations that we've met. Up to this point, it could be the same thing as how we observe ourselves in the matter, and it reflects our mind based on what we've manifested to ourselves or who we are. Ordinary language, a philosophical methodology that sees traditional philosophical problems as rooted in misunderstandings philosophers develop by distorting or forgetting how words are ordinarily used to convey meaning in non-philosophical contexts. Knowing that technical terminology or notion must be examined by philosophers of law, biology, religion, formal logic, and so on. If an ordinary is compared to technical or specialist, then some philosophy is concerned with ordinary language while another philosophy is not. And in this regard, Ryle is often described as a philosopher of the ordinary language, or as advocating that philosophy ought to be concerned with the ordinary use of language. Ryle and his contemporaries are concerned with the informal logic of expression use, the nature of the logical force that expressions have as components of theories and as pivots of specific arguments. He talked about us debating expressions in the same breath. We're trying to capture what we're exposing, we're codifying the very logical codes that we're seeing at that time. He concedes that the logical behavior of terms of non-notational discourse can be aided by studies in formal logic. Ryle believed that the body and mind are not two distinct entities. In Subject to Mind, our physical body and non-physical mind is harnessed together while we are alive, and until our death, only our mind continues to exist and function. The Ghost in the Machine emphasizes the fact that the mind and body are made up of two distinct substances, namely, mental and physical substances. Although his concept of dualism stated that our body somehow is subjected to time and space, while our mind is only subjected to time. Though, beyond the human body, our mind is an unexplainable phenomenon or a mysterious thing where the soul of the person is considered by it.